What I've learned from putting these videos together to take the juiciest bits from a wrestler's autobiography, either you guys really like controversial takes, or you don't like reading books. Either way, I'm happy to present another one of these videos to you guys because you seem to really like them. So let's check out the tome that is Bret Hart's autobiography. I actually read this book twice, God love me. Once when it was first released, and then again a few years later when I wanted to research something but ended up getting sucked right back in. It's such an extensive book that it's hard to remember little bits and pieces, but all you really gotta do is search up some keywords and you'll get what you're looking for. You should be happy to know that I've completely left out Montreal here because I think we all know what Bret had to say about it. And I've also seriously condensed the HBK and Kliq stuff to a single section because, again, I think everyone already knows what Bret thought about Shawn and his group. So, let's get started. From reading Bret's book, you quickly learn that the Hitman once considered Hogan a good friend. He kinda looked up to Hulk even though he didn't think much of his in-ring work from bell to bell. It all went downhill though in 1993 during WrestleMania 9. When I read my booking sheets, I realised I'd see Hulk Hogan at TVs in North Charleston, South Carolina on March 8th. Even though he'd been making the odd appearance on various shows since December 92, I hadn't laid eyes on him since WrestleMania 8. I really thought he'd be proud of me, so when I pulled up to the back of the arena, I went looking for him. I didn't have to look far, he was standing chatting with Beefcake, leaning against the wall on the ramp. His appearance had changed drastically, he looked like a lean old walrus. He was tanned and wore red spandex tights, big white boots, and a bandana covering his balding head. I approached him with a huge smile and my hand extended in friendship. Hogan gave me a dismissive nod and wouldn't shake my hand. I figured that because I was champion now, he saw me as the competition. Hulkamania had run so wild that it had burned itself out like a grass fire. And here I was, one of the new brightly coloured flowers popping up to haunt him. On April 2nd, 93, I brought Stu and Helen with me to Vegas for WrestleMania 9, where my mum was also going to have a family reunion with her 4 sisters. I left them to reminisce and went to my room just in time to answer a call from Vince, who asked me to come to his suite to talk. I knocked on his door and he answered it with that goofy grin. We sat down and Vince said, "This is what I want you to do. I want you to drop the belt to Yoko tomorrow." I sat there dumbstruck as he went on to explain how Fuji would screw me by throwing salt in my face, blinding me. After Yoko was handed the belt, Hogan would rush to my aid, and in some kind of roundabout way, Hogan would end up winning the belt from Yoko right then and there. Like I was handing Vince my sword, I told him I appreciated everything he did for me and I'd do whatever he wanted. Vince said, "Don't get bitter, I still have big plans for you." Soundbites flashed through my mind of Vince assuring me that I was the long-term champion and not to worry about Hogan, who still hadn't even spoken to me yet. As I stood up to leave, I asked, "Did you take the belt from me because I didn't do a good enough job?" "Of course not, I'm just going in a different direction. It's still onwards and upwards for you. Nothing's going to change too much for you." I was totally crushed. By the time I got to the dressing room the following afternoon, word that I was losing the title had leaked out to the boys. Most of them were quiet and some were angry. The Nasty Boys, Shawn, Taker and several others expressed their utter disappointment. Hulk arrived with his entourage, his wife, manager, Beefcake and Jimmy Hart. Clearly he'd been in the know all along, probably from the first day he came back. Now he was suddenly acting like my long lost old pal and wearing a big smile that rightfully belonged to me. During the match, as scripted, with my face buried in the crook of my arm, I waved to him to avenge my loss. "Go get him, Hulk." I was really thinking, go ahead Hogan, take from me what I worked so hard to get. We'll see how long you last. Hogan was champion again without even having a match, and before I'd even made it backstage. A few minutes later, Hogan came up to me excited and happy and said, "Thank you brother, I won't forget it. I'll be happy to return the favour." I looked my old friend in the eye and said, "I'm gonna remember that, Terry." As soon as Hogan had taken the belt back, house show attendance nosedived. WWF wrestlers were paid a percentage of the gate, and it made me feel good when most of the boys told me they hoped I'd get the belt back. On May 29th, Vince called me at home to tell me the big news that I was getting the belt back. What I didn't expect to hear was that he was getting ready to call Hogan, and he hated the thought of telling him that he was too old and tired for a company whose marketing strategy was now based around a new generation concept. 10 days later, Vince called again. He warned me that he was about to tell me something that would make me really angry. Hogan was flat out refusing to put me over, saying I wasn't in his league. Vince had decided that Yoko would be getting the belt instead. I couldn't believe that Hogan would do this to me. I remembered him shaking my hand at WrestleMania 9 and telling me he'd be happy to return the favour. Vince said he'd have one more meeting with Hogan to try to sell him on it, but if he didn't go for it, I'd be working with Lawler at SummerSlam instead. Hogan didn't go for it. I wanted to believe that Vince hadn't told me the whole story, and I made up my mind to confront Hogan as soon as he dropped the belt to Yoko. I'd wait till then, because it didn't seem right to me to change Yoko's destiny. I showed up to the dressing room for King of the Ring in a dark mood, and promptly drew a blackboard cartoon of Beefcake with his head buried in Hogan's ass cheeks with a caption that read, "Be careful, Brutus, you don't want to loosen the screws in your face." Speaking of screws. I was taking out my frustration on Beefcake, which wasn't right, but I was too pissed off to know it at the time. I went backstage and watched Hogan and Yoko on a monitor. They moved in slow motion like a walrus squaring off against a hippopotamus. I rolled my eyes at how lame the finish was. Once Hogan got back to his dressing room, I knocked on the door and stepped in. I said, "Terry, I want to speak with you." We stared at each other. "You told me at WrestleMania 9 that you'd be happy to return the favour, and as I understand it, now you don't want to even work with me. You won't put me over, and I'm not in your league." Hogan stood there speechless, so I carried on. "Well, you're right, you're not in my league. On behalf of myself, my family, and most of the boys in the dressing room, you can go f*** yourself." He stuttered, "Brother, you don't know the whole story." "I got the story directly from Vince," I said. "Terry, you haven't said 10 words to me since you got back almost 4 months ago. If you want to level with me, then go ahead, I'm right here." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because you told me to go f*** myself." "That's right, and I'll tell you again, go f*** yourself." I turned and walked out, heading straight for the ring to wrestle Bam Bam Bigelow for the main event finale of the tournament. Vince pulled me aside to lecture me about how it was unprofessional of me to tell Hogan off. In fact, of the three of us, I felt that I was the only one who was being professional. Davey Boy Smith may be a member of the Hart family, but Bret makes it clear in his book that he was disappointed with Davey on more than one occasion. SummerSlam 92 sticks out because Bret and Davey had such a great match, but behind the scenes, things were spiralling out of control for the British Bulldog. It was official, SummerSlam 92 would be at Wembley Stadium in London. Davey was back on the road, and Vince was going with my idea to drop the IC belt to him. As the summer slipped away, I constantly phoned Davey down in Florida, but all Diana could tell me was that he was out with Jim Neidhart somewhere. I finally tracked Jim down just hours before I was leaving for England, and was shocked when he told me that he had just taken Davey and Diana to the airport. Davey was high as a kite when he caught his flight, Jim said, because he'd been up all night smoking crack with him. Jim told me that Davey had a gorilla on his back and he was worried about him. I wish Jim would take a good look at himself. I couldn't have been more disappointed in Davey and feared he would end up making us both look bad. I set out to find Davey, but he was off somewhere with Diana and his family. I didn't see him until the required entrance rehearsal at Wembley Stadium the night before the show. When I asked him why he hadn't returned my calls all summer, he wasn't able to look at me in the eye. He fessed up that he had been smoking crack with Jim for weeks and was now terrified. He had gone back to being that same helpless kid I rescued from the Dynamite Kid 10 years earlier. "Trust me, Davey, and I'll do all I can to get you through tomorrow, okay?" He nodded, and I set him down for a crash course, going over and over our match and making him recite the moves back to me. It was now completely up to me to save our match. At first, Davey outmaneuvered me with simple and realistic wrestling, but after only a few minutes, he was breathing hard. "Bret, I'm fucked," Davey panted as I had him clamped in a side headlock. "I can't remember anything." "Davey, just listen to me and I'll carry you." So that's how it was, me calling out every single high spot for Davey, sometimes even the necessary facial expressions, helping him conserve what little stamina he had for a comeback that was still more than 30 minutes away. Every time Davey picked me up, I went up like a feather, he went up like a full refrigerator. At the end of the match, I made out that I was too pissed off to shake Davey's hand. I'd planned all this with Davey, but it became painfully obvious to me that he had forgotten all about it. I desperately tried to make eye contact, but he was oblivious as Diana climbed into the ring crying. I can only assume for real. I'm thinking, come on Davey, look at me and we'll make them all cry. But Davey never caught on. Instead, he was trying to milk the crowd. I was thinking, the drama's with me, not them. For f***'s sake, please look at me, Davey. After too many attempts, I gave up and just walked over and shook his hand. He had completely missed one of the tiny moments that can make it all more real. But what could I do? The torch had been passed. We heard what Ric Flair had to say about Bret in the Nature Boys book, To Be the Man. Bret's book was released after the Nature Boys, so Hart already knew what Slick Rick said about him. Basically, Flair said he didn't think Bret was a draw, and he didn't see Bret as a top player in the wacky world of professional wrestling. The Observer often raved about Flair being the best in the business. I'd never seen him work because it was impossible to follow the rival TV show on my schedule. Steamboat, Piper and Harley, among others, all had great regard for Flair as a worker. I would face Flair for the first time at the New Havens TV on November 13th, and I was looking forward to finding out whether he was the best worker in the business, as all the marks and wrestling commentators generally declared. Flair was what my dad called a routine man, because he did the same match every night no matter who he worked with. He also liked to call every step of the match with little input from me. When we talked before the match, he had suggested a finish that called for me doing a flying tackle where he'd catch me and stagger backwards with the two of us toppling over the top rope only to be counted out for the finish, which would be a double DQ. It was a simple move that I'd done countless times with less skilled wrestlers, but at the end of the match, when I dove into Flair, he stood too far from the ropes, mistimed it, and didn't have the strength to catch me, so we fell down in a heap. I'm just going to cut in here and say I watched this whole match. You're seeing video and pictures of it right now, and I don't know what Bret's talking about here. It didn't happen. Maybe that part was cut out for its inclusion in the Invasion 1992 VHS, but I'm not sure what Bret's talking about. Anyway, on the spot, Rick came up with a makeshift finish that, not surprisingly, benefited him and not me. I wasn't going to make a big deal out of it, but back in the dressing room, I was annoyed to hear Flair crying to me about what happened on the finish, implying that I had screwed up. He showed me right then and there that he wasn't as great as he was supposed to be. I'd heard there were a lot of wrestlers who didn't trust or like Flair, and I was starting to see why. Soon enough, I was launched on return bouts with Flair, who seemed bent on sabotaging our matches. I wasn't sure if he was doing it accidentally or on purpose, but he was never there for me on my comeback and seemed to bungle the finish every night. I began to refer to Rick's ring style as full blast, non-stop, non-psychology. He made things up on the spot and did them whether they made sense or not. As a technician, Flair was one of the best, but I was baffled by how little he really knew about building a great match, and I was even more baffled by how this went undetected by fans and sheet riders who continued to worship him. The death of Bret's younger brother Owen's covered extensively in Bret's book, and it's all quite harrowing. From the accident itself all the way to the Hart family becoming completely divided over a potential lawsuit against the WWF. Bret felt that some of his family members were being easily manipulated by Vince McMahon. He thought many of his family members were sucking up to Vince after the incident in hopes of getting money or even a job. And I highly recommend you check the book out yourself if you want to learn more. Owen's death almost completely destroyed the Hart family, and in the centre of it all were Owen's widow Martha and Vince McMahon. Here's a snippet. Leaving the media circus at Hart House, I drove over to see Martha. I was amazed by her composure. She had already called a lawyer friend of hers by the name of Pam Fisher to seek legal advice. I watched the news with Martha, and there, on camera, was Davey, looking much better than he had in a long while. I couldn't believe it when Davey said that Owen's death was just an accident and that it was nobody's fault. Who was Davey to say whose fault it was when the police were still investigating what had happened? Davey then vowed he had returned to the WWF to win a title in Owen's honour. I did Good Morning America at 4 AM Calgary time in Stu's living room with Martha and my parents. I arrived unshaven and weary. Martha's lawyers were there to guard against anything being said that could jeopardise her legal standing with the WWF, so I focused on how the business had strayed too far from the premise of two athletes telling a story using only their bodies. Pro wrestling had become a can you top this rating war of increasingly more dangerous stunts and sleazy storylines. Owen was no stuntman, and clearly someone didn't know what they were doing. A union of wrestlers was long overdue, I said. At least if we had one, there'd be guidelines to distinguish between wrestling and stunt work, and there would be protection when someone got hurt. Meanwhile, Vince left me numerous phone messages pleading with me to call him back. I told Vince that I didn't appreciate that they went on with the show after Owen died. He replied that nobody knew what to do, they were so shocked, and they were afraid the fans might riot if he stopped the show. That struck me as ridiculous, and I said that if Shane had been dropped from the ceiling, Vince would have stopped it fast. He simply said, "We didn't know what to do." I didn't appreciate them airing a replay for profit either, and I didn't like watching Raw the day after Owen's death, when wrestlers sick with grief were given no choice about pouring their hearts out on live TV for ratings. I said a more fitting tribute to Owen would have been to celebrate his career by showcasing his matches. Then I sighed and told Vince that this never would have happened to Owen if I'd been there. Owen always came to me for advice, and I would have shot such a stupid idea down fast. It's no secret that Bret didn't enjoy his time in WCW, and the vast majority of fans didn't like Bret's run in the company either. Honestly, through reliving the war, I found a new appreciation for Bret's WCW work, and while it really doesn't compare to his WWF run, there's still a few gems to be found from the Hitman's time in Atlanta. The general consensus though is that it was a bad time for Bret, and Bret thought the same. On my first visit to WCW offices in Atlanta on December 14th, I bumped into Hogan, Macho and Eric Bischoff, who smiled confidently at me as he said, "If you think you're a big star now, you're going to be an even bigger star when I'm done with you." Hogan said what had happened between him and me before he left WWF was all Vince's fault. He said that Vince had bragged to him that he loved to ride the boys into the ground, then cook them and eat them. The truth was that Hogan didn't put me over when he had the chance for his own reasons. Because we needed to work together, however, I shook his hand when he offered it and told him I was sorry for anything I said about him after he left the WWF. He grinned back like I was an old friend. He also surprised me by giving me a compliment. He said he thought I was the best interview in the business now, even though I knew that honour really belonged to Stone Cold. In the face of relentless competition from Vince, Eric Bischoff seemed to be burning out in 1998, and as a result, the disorganisation at the WCW was getting worse. Vince's Shock TV pushed the envelope of what the censors would allow, and Bischoff looked more lost and confused every day. He had to put out a product that fit within Ted Turner's squeaky clean guidelines, and Vince knew it. Maybe it's a good thing that Eric couldn't go that way, even if he wanted to. I liked Eric and often offered him ideas. I don't know if it was pride or politics that made him shoot them down one by one. His own angles rarely made sense. They'd fly me to TV, paying for first class airfare, hotel and a luxury car, only to leave me off the show. At the end of the day, in the WWF I got screwed for money, while in WCW I got paid well enough for so little output that I felt a bit too much like a whore. Vince Russo's a weird subject when it comes to Bret Hart. As you'll soon find out, Hart wasn't happy with Russo's plans for Owen at Over the Edge 99. But then you've got the Russo and Bret relationship in WCW, where Vince booked Bret to win the WCW Championship, something that Hogan and Bischoff flat out refused to do. Russo stated that the very first thing he wanted to do was bring Bret back to the main event scene, and to his credit, he did just that. But Bret doesn't care much when it comes to Russo. He doesn't care for him a single bit, actually. It was Russo who'd come up with the idea for the Blue Blazer to descend from the rafters in Kansas City. As soon as Owen landed in the ring, he was supposed to trip and fall as a spoof on wrestling superheroes. That's why there had been no safety line. Owen had to release himself quickly so he could deliver Russo's pratfall. I'm not laying blame here. It's punishment enough that Russo has to live with the knowledge of his role in Owen's death. At WCW, we were hanging on for dear life trying to put over Vince Russo's weird storylines. Russo thought his storylines had a lot to do with the WWF's rise in the ratings war, but he didn't get, and never would, that the best wrestling needed at least to pretend to be real. He had grand plans for me as a heel. I told him that the sympathy factor for me was too strong to pull off a heel turn, not to mention that I'd been turned so many times already. He still wanted to do this big angle on Nitro where I turned on Goldberg the day after Starrcade 99 in Toronto. I hated it all, but I was so angry at McMahon that I hoped Russo could bring the company back to life with his radical soap opera booking. Again, we all know how Bret feels about Goldberg. You can look this up and get many quotes from the Hitman that range from downright funny to downright vicious. Bret's book was written at a time when a lot of his negativity towards Bill hadn't festered yet, but it's still really grim reading about before Starrcade 99 and after Starrcade 99. I was also impressed with the look of Bill Goldberg, a muscle-packed former NFLer who went simply by his last name. Goldberg was bald-headed with an angry face punctuated by a goatee. All he needed to be intimidating was simple black trunks and low-cut black boots. He made his entrance to dramatic marching music, pausing just long enough to pound his chest in a haze of billowing smoke. He was destined to be WCW's new weapon in the battle of supremacy against Vince. Unfortunately, Bill was green and was injuring a lot of guys too. I kept working as many house shows as I could because I wanted to whittle down the number of days I was required to work in order to have more time off in the summer. I worked some house shows with Goldberg down south in Alabama and Florida. Goldberg was no fun. Every night he mowed me down with his full contact spear tackle, only to have Razor, Nash and Sid run in for the DQ to save the belt for me. Starrcade 99 came on December 19th, 99 at the MCI Centre in Washington DC. I sat on my bench strapping on my knee brace, wrapping my battered wrists and knees. My ribs were sore from Goldberg spearing me. They'd been tender for at least 10 years, ever since Dino Bravo knocked me into that steel fence back in 1989. I stretched and paced as I waited for my match with Goldberg. "Whatever you do out there, Bill, don't hurt me," I said. I really wanted this to be a great match. On Thursday, January 13, I sat in Dr. Mewis's office in Calgary, telling him about Goldberg's ferocious kick to my neck while he felt around with his fingers. He noticed that I was slurring my words and asked if I thought I had a concussion. I told him maybe a slight one. He probed me with questions and then recited some numbers and asked me to repeat them back to him backwards. I couldn't. Then he gave me 5 random words that he had asked me to remember in a few minutes. I couldn't. He studied me, then asked me again if I thought I had a concussion. I told him again, a slight one. "I can feel a hole in the back of your neck the size of a quarter." He felt around the back of my skull. "This part here feels like a hamburger." "I have a pay-per-view on Sunday. I'm in the main event." With a dry smile, he said, "You're not going anywhere. The problem with people that have concussions is that you think you're okay, but you're not." He paused and crossed his arms, looking at me in the eye. "I hate to be the one to have to tell you this, but your career is probably over." As mentioned at the top of the video, I simply couldn't talk about every mention of Shawn Michaels and the Kliq because I'd be here all day. So I've took some other little bits out of the book to round off the video. If you're anything like me, you've already heard enough about Montreal 10 or 15 years ago, so let's look at some other quotes from the book. Davey and I worked tags all over Germany and the UK with Owen and Jim during a European tour in 1994. The thing I remember most about that tour was Shawn, Razor and Nash talking to me in Hamburg about the idea of forming a clique of top guys who strictly took care of their own. This is what Buddy Rogers did in the 1950s, working only with his selected clique to get him over so they could monopolise the cash flow. These boys wanted me to be their leader, to voice concerns pertaining to the group as a whole. And I'm just going to jump in here again to say that both Kevin Nash and Sean Waltman publicly denied this on Twitter. Even when reading Bret's book all those years ago, I found this to be a bit far-fetched, but I also remember Bret saying this again during an Inside the Rope show I attended a few years back. So it's not just a one-off thing he mentioned in the book by accident. Whatever the case, it was totally denied by Nash and Waltman. Even though they were my friends, I couldn't see it, and with the exception of Nash, their degree of pill popping was something I didn't want to be around. I told them, ultimately, everybody has to work their way to the top all by themselves. If someone can outperform me every night in every part of the world, then go ahead, step up and do it. One big difference between me and Sean, which would cost him, was that I appreciated my undercard. I always took the time to shake the hands of even the lowest jobber. A relatively small babyface always needs the heels to make him, but Sean treated a lot of the wrestlers like they weren't good enough to work with him. The Kliq had managed to alienate themselves from nearly everyone, even the ring crew. Ron Harris didn't take kindly to Sean's remarks about his match. He grabbed a terrified Sean by the neck in the shower at Madison Square Garden and told him if he wise-assed him again, he'd shove his head up his ass. The Road Warriors and Miss Elizabeth had shown up in WCW, and word was that Diesel and Razor were considering jumping too. This was a shock to everybody, especially Sean, who looked anxious at the thought of being left behind. Despite the overall tension between the boys and the Kliq, Shawn and I had never let on to each other that there were any problems between us. He told me that he hoped Diesel and Razor would stay because after he became champion at WrestleMania 12, he figured on working with them. I suggested he had fresh guys to work with, such as Vader and Austin. He nervously chewed on his nail, spit out a piece and shook his head. I think I'd rather work with Hunter and do another little program with the kid. I had spoken up for Owen, Jim and Davey over the years, but I never pushed them to the exclusion of everybody else, as Shawn fully intended to do with his Kliq. I realised then that the Heartbreak Kid didn't have the heart to be champion. You don't have to look far on the internet to find more examples of Bret burying people he used to work with, and yeah, as much as I love the Hitman, he does come across pretty bitter sometimes, and I can see why this would be a turn-off for some fans. With that in mind, I do feel that Bret's very justified in what he says, and I also applaud him for his honesty. Finding honest main eventers in a world full of carnies is so rare, especially during Bret's era. So I say appreciate Bret while he's still here, and let the Hitman go off as much as he wants. He's always an entertaining interview once he gets started. Thank you very much for watching, folks, and please take care.